All right. Welcome, everyone. My name is Irene Maslowski. I am an adjunct professor of public relations at New York University and City College in the undergraduate program. And I'm the current chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for PRSA's Educators Academy. This year, as I think probably most of you know, IPR and PRSA rebranded the virtual program of Race in the Classroom, Race in the PR Classroom, to Diversity within the PR Classroom. This was, done to enable us to expand our conversations beyond race and the challenges and opportunities that DEI can offer us as they evolve for students, practitioners, and educators. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize the Moody College of Communications, our sponsor, Moody College of Communications at the University of Texas in Austin. Thank you so much for supporting our program. IPR and PRSA have been partnering for this panel discussion since June of 2020. And at that time, we featured primarily BPIOC leaders talking about race in the classroom. But today, for our inaugural program, this episode of Diversity in the PR Classroom, we welcome a discussion on the LGBTQIA+ voices in the PR and communications industry. So I want to welcome and thank our panelists who are here today. First, we welcome Dr. Chelsea Reynolds, Associate Professor at California State University at Fullerton, where she teaches mass media and diversity, media ethics, and sexual communications. Her research examines public discourse about human sexuality, sex work, and queer communities. Next, I'd like to introduce Byron Kimball. Byron is a media specialist with Mixte Communications in California. It's a marketing and public relations agency. Before coming to Mixte, Byron worked alongside community groups, law firms, and environmental nonprofits and foundations. He is a graduate of Western Oregon University. Last but not least, Dr. Brenda Wrigley, my professor at Syracuse University when I was in grad school, who is now at Curry College in Milton, Massachusetts, in the School of Business and Computer Science. Dr. Wrigley's research interests include gender and diversity in the communications industry, LGBTQ issues for corporations, social justice, public diplomacy, and public relations role in crisis communications. And very last but not least, I'd like to introduce Nitra Henry from IPR, who will be our moderator for today. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping rules. If you have a question, please place it in the chat box. If you are called upon, or raise your virtual hand. If you are called upon to speak, please state your name and your organization. If you would like to ask a question anonymously, you can also message the host in the chat box. They will read your question aloud. However, you will still remain anonymous. So please feel free to use that option. Today's session will be recorded. It should be available within 48 hours after today's program. And last but not least, please make sure that you mute just out of respect for everybody on the call, on the program. So with that, thank you again for all being here. Looking forward to an excellent panel program today. And I will turn it over to Anitra.
Thank you, Irene, and thank everyone for being here. Let's go ahead and get started. We've got a great discussion for you today. So I want to ask this question to each of our panelists, and actually, Dr. Wrigley, I'm going to start with you. What does the acronym LGBTQIA mean? And is there more weight to any one community over another?
Well, big questions. The acronym tries to be as inclusive as it can be, and I think to some extent it is. But there are members of certain portions of our community who have traditionally been further marginalized and left out, particularly the transgender community. They were left out at the beginning of the movement almost completely. And I think because of that, it's been difficult for them to find acceptance and understanding. This has led to widespread transphobia. It's led to legislation in certain states that is ill-informed and punitive. Here in Boston, hospitals treating transgender children have been threatened. So we have a long way to go, even though we claim to have an inclusive acronym.
Byron, what would you add to what does the acronym mean? And is there any more weight to any one community than over another?
Yeah, thank you, Netra. I'd actually like to add on to what Dr. Wrigley's talked about. As a member of the trans community myself, I think historically, like a lot of what we've seen over the decades is that while the trans community has long been a part of the acronym, and we, however, haven't really seen a representation that, or really the movement towards equity that I think we've seen for other sections of the LGBT community. Where, for instance, if you remember about a decade or so ago, like a big focus of activism in the LGBT community was focused upon marriage and adoption, all very critical components of representation for LGBTQ adults and youth. That being said, things that the transgender community really depends upon for our representation and our inclusion, including the right to transition without repercussions at work or at school, the right for children to access medication and therapy before the age of 18, and so on and so forth. All these things were either just not talked about before very recently, or outright excluded by major LGBTQ organizations. And I think I'll go ahead and pass it along back to you, Netra.
Dr. Reynolds, what would you add to this? And I'm going to ask you to expound a little bit, and Dr. Wrigley and Byron, jump in here if you have anything to add. When we talk about more weight to any one community represented in the acronym over another, are there advantages to having these communities represented all together? Are there disadvantages to having the communities represented all together?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's amazing that we're beginning this discussion with the erasure of trans folks from media systems over the last few decades. And the changes that we're seeing, I think, are important to point out as well. Beyond that, for myself personally, I am cisgendered, meaning that I was assigned female at birth and I continue to identify as a woman. As a bisexual woman in a same-sex partnership, I think we see a continued sort of minimization of Bifolks in mass communications, and in queer communities, Bifolks are often just completely ignored or diminished, belittled, or rejected. So the latest Gallup poll that came out a couple years ago is identifying 1 in 6 Gen Z individuals as part of the LGBTQIA communities. Half of those folks are bisexual. And yet we see very little representation and very little analysis of the systemic oppressions of Bifolks. Bifolks experience a lot of physical violence, a lot of intimate partner violence, and rape as well. So I think that these things are important to highlight. The queer communities are not homogenous, just like we think of Latinx communities, right? There's a major difference between, for instance, folks who are from Mexico or identify as Mexican American or Chicano, compared with folks from the Caribbean or from South America. And I think in the same way, I'm talking about these things because I'm here in Southern California, where my student body is very queer and very Latinx. You know, belonging to the lesbian community that I'm part of here in Los Angeles is a very different thing than belonging to, you know, the asexual community or the intersex community. These are different communities, and to homogenize them and put them into a single category, I think is a political tool in some circumstances, and in other cases sort of diminishes the important differences between our different and diverse groups.
Thank you for that. Dr. Wrigley or Byron, do you have anything that you want to add along the lines of, are there advantages or disadvantages to having all of the communities represented in the acronym? Do you feel like there's any pressure to silence? Dr. Reynolds, you just touched on this. Any pressure to silence one community when you have all represented in one acronym?
I can speak a bit to this. So like speaking to like advantages, I mean, I think, you know, collectively, all the different communities in the LGBT community, I think experience discrimination and marginalization as a result of what I consider to be one thing, which is gender expression. Like, you know, how are we, like, what's assumed to be correct or right for like someone assigned male versus someone assigned female, like whether that's, you know, who you love or how you ultimately identify. And that's, of course, a very like way to really simplify it. So like definitely feel free to add on to that. As far as like disadvantages, I mean, I think, again, going back to the differences between our different communities, you know, each community has very, very, very different needs. And I think the politics of coming out and how we live our lives are very different. You know, for instance, coming out looks very different, or coming out publicly is very different for someone who identifies as cisgender and gay versus, say, transgender at like any sexuality. You know, if you're gay, like you, I think the expectation a while back was, you know, coming out is like something you do, and maybe it's an active process, but it's something that you disclose. Like, whereas you know, being trans, you know, on some level, you know, it's like a lot of people do choose to disclose like their past and their transition history. But the way I see it is, like, if you're trans and you're living as the gender you identify as, like, that's you coming out, like that's, you know, you living your life. And I think there's still like a big expectation that those of us in the trans community like need to disclose everything about our transition histories and pasts in order to like really be seen as fully valid in the LGBT community. Like, even though you're out because you're living your life. And maybe the same could be said as far as other sexualities and gender and ways, and, you know, other aspects of being trans or non-binary. But, you know, I think there's a lot of nuances that are experienced based on either, you know, whether you're in the LGBT community because of your sexuality or because of your gender identity, that I think that's a conversation we're still opening up.
Thank you, Byron. So I want to, I'm sorry, Dr. Wrigley.
I just wanted to mention, I think there are political advantages to the collective acronym, but as Byron has alluded to, it does not take into account at all the intersectionality of each person and the individual needing to be seen as an individual and understood as an individual. And that requires work on everybody's part in building relationships and working with people, work that many people are not willing to do. And I think recognizing that is the first step in building greater understanding in individual relationships.
Thank you, Dr. Wrigley. Very important point. I would like to, next, Dr. Reynolds, I want to ask you a question as we focus on communications and PR. particularly. How can communications and PR professionals understand the difference between authentic engagement and pandering or queer washing?
I think this is one of the most important questions about LGBTQ communications that could possibly be brought up in this discussion. So I'm really glad it's being asked. First things first, let's make sure that we understand what it means to authentically represent, if that's possible, versus pander to different LGBTQIA communities. In my research and discussions at different conferences over the years, the terms queer baiting and rainbow washing tend to come up. And these are terms that, for example, Dr. E. Sizek down at UT Austin works with consistently in their research. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly so you can see hopefully an example of Katy Perry and some logos from corporate Twitter accounts and Instagram accounts over the years. Can we see this? Sorry, I'm unsure if we can't. Oh, too bad. Post disabled participant screen sharing. Oh, that's too bad.
I just enabled it. So you should be able to now.
Okay. There we go. Okay. Are we now seeing a Katy Perry and some corporate logos? Okay, good. So this is what we don't want to do. Let me explain first what we call rainbow washing, which is what you see on the right side of the screen, the corporate logos for Uber and Twitter and MasterCard. Every June, every Pride Month, all of us queer folks are bombarded with these images. And it's like, oh, we're visible for 1 month of the year. How lucky are we to be seen by Uber and MasterCard and Lyft and American Airlines? And it makes us feel, I guess, momentarily seen, which is nice, but it's terrible that this visibility discontinues after June ends. All of these logos go back to being, black and blue and red, and they're no longer the beautiful rainbow of representation that we see here. And I think that when we see this rainbow washing, it's often to sell merchandise or to sort of, like at Target, when you walk in during Pride Month, for example, every t-shirt has a rainbow on it. And that's nice. Again, it's nice to feel visible, but it's not so nice when that visibility disappears spontaneously. Queer baiting, on the other hand, is sort of like the Katy Perry song, I Kissed a Girl and I Like It. I liked it. It teases this identity of queerness or teases a queer storyline. There are many famous pop stars and I think also corporations that sort of use queer side characters or queer subplots in order to increase engagement. And again, it's nice to feel visible, but it's not so nice to always be the bridesmaid and not the bride, so to speak. So I think it would be, in corporations' best interest to authentically engage queerness in their corporate communications. And beyond that, of course, to have queer people in the boardroom. And I'm not just talking about gay men, especially gay white men. I'm talking about truly embracing the many different, letters that are represented under the LGBTQIA acronym. So of course, bringing queer people into decision-making roles and providing material support for queer communities. When we talk about social responsibility, corporate social responsibility, I think it's important that we put our money where our mouth is, so to speak, and make sure that material resources, profits or proceeds from Pride Month merchandise are going back directly to the queer communities that they should serve, or to, for instance, HIV/AIDS organizations, sex work outreach organizations. This can feel really political for major brands, but it's the only way not to pander, really, by using queer identity to increase capital.
Awesome. Byron, I want to throw this same question to you because you're working in this every single day. What would you say is necessary for PR and communications professionals to understand about authentic engagement versus queer washing or pandering?
Yeah, well, thank you, Netra. I mean, I think Dr. Reynolds is exactly right in highlighting like how pervasive like the idea of tokenism and queer washing can be. And so I think really the answer is like deepening our representation of both members of the LGBT community and the issues that we care about. Not just in June, but beyond. And I think really like it can be a lofty question, but there's so much we can do at really just every level of organization. And so, for instance, one thing that I'm starting to see more of, and there's a lot of room for us to build on, is hiring more members of the LGBT community in our firms and across our agencies. That being said, of course, what I think we're still missing, and where there's like definitely a lot of room to grow, is whether we're promoting LGBTQ community members to higher levels of organization. Because you can bring on like you can bring on account coordinators, and you can bring on like entry level communicators, and that's great. That provides members of our community a chance to grow and build skills so that they can be promoted. But are we also recognizing the talent in LGBTQ professionals and then promoting them to these higher level positions as they gain these skills? And finally, I think the other thing too is, are we also providing that representation outside of Pride related events? If we have spokespeople who are trans or otherwise members of the LGBT community, are we also seeing them like speak out for? Are they also representing campaigns in the environmental sector, in the finance sector? And are they also being allowed to speak out on things that are not Pride related? Because those of us in the LGBT community, like being LGBT is not our only area of expertise.
Absolutely.
It can be. But, for example, like, yes, I'm a member of the trans community, but I am also like an environmental communications expert. I'm also experienced in media relations for like a variety of issues in the nonprofit sector. And so, yes, like there are aspects of my identity that are very important to me and inform who I am, but they're not the sum all of my experience. And I think recognizing that is, absolutely key to, bettering our representation of LGBTQ issues. It's not just focusing on what makes us part of the community, but it's accepting that our identities is part of who we are as professionals and as a community.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Byron. Dr. Wrigley, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Well, in the academic literature, we refer to this as requisite variety, which means that audiences must see in spokespeople and in people representing companies and organizations, people with whom they can connect and people they can relate to. I have exercises I do in some of my PR classes where I give students particular companies to research and to look at their management teams and their boards of directors. And it is rare for us to find, as both of the other speakers have pointed out, that requisite variety representation. It's just not there. And, it reminds me of Langston Hughes' statement, down so low, it looks like up from here. We can't get complacent about the fact that while things are improving in a number of areas, as both have pointed out, there is just so much more to do.
Thank you for that, Dr. Wrigley. And I want to stick with you for just a few moments and think about the classroom. And you talked about your students. How do we encourage engagement within the classroom setting? Are there best practices for sharing stories, starting uncomfortable conversations without silencing people?
Well, I think we have to be careful as we would with any underrepresented group, to not single out a person in the classroom and sort of by default appoint them as the spokesperson for that group. That's a mistake that we've all made early in our careers. Hopefully we don't make it anymore. I certainly will own up to that mistake. If you're comfortable self-identifying, I think you should. I do. I have since I began teaching 27 years ago. 27 years ago, that was not as welcome a disclosure as it might be today. But I think it breaks the ice and it shows students that you are open and you're willing to have discussions. I'm in liberal Massachusetts, where students by and large tend to be more accepting, open, inclusive. But within those groups, there are pockets of misunderstanding, fear, and ignorance, to be honest. So I think we can't make too many assumptions going in. But as educators, we need to help each other figure out how to have these classroom conversations. Maybe hold a workshop where you invite colleagues, you tell them how you do it, or you talk about things that have happened in the classroom that were uncomfortable. I think it's good to be uncomfortable because I think it helps people experience things and grow.
Dr. Reynolds, what would you add to that? How do we encourage students in today's classroom to speak out, be okay with the uncomfortable conversations? How do we foster that in our PR and communications in other classrooms as well?
Yeah, this is a challenging topic depending on where you are geographically in the world and culturally in the world. I think all of us in this room that are speaking today, Byron, Dr. Wrigley, and myself, live in relatively liberal or blue-leaning areas where queerness is not such a transgressive topic as it might be in somewhere like Alabama or Mississippi or Idaho. In my classrooms, I always try to, as Dr. Wrigley pointed out, I try to disclose my identity very close to the beginning of the semester to make sure that queer folks know it is a welcoming space and that I myself belong to a community that they may also be part of, because queer identities aren't necessarily visible, right? We don't have as a femme presenting person, I don't have the visibility that some other folks might just walking into a classroom. So I think calling that out for myself, for my students is important. I also try to bring in lots of guest speakers that represent all sorts of communities, not just the queer community, not just lesbian, gay, bi, trans, intersex, and asexual folks, but bring in speakers that are from all sorts of different sectors in the communications professions that aren't just, cis folks who are white. So I think embracing diversity, especially to show students that it doesn't matter who you are, you can succeed in these career paths and see yourself in that corner office or in that ivory tower or what have you, if that's your goal. I think it's also important that in our lesson plans, we include examples just in the assignments that we give that don't just include nuclear families, that don't just include, professional entities that are dominated by cis, straight, white folks. We can talk about businesses that are POC run, or we could talk about how this queer communications company has led its corporate initiatives. I think these are things that we can do easily. So incorporate queer examples, bring in queer guest speakers, disclose our own identities. And I'm finding that at least with my students here in Southern California, Gen Z folks, even if they're straight, even if they're cisgender, they are really curious about LGBTQ folks. Everybody's been watching, for instance, Pose or Drag Race or Sex Education on Netflix. And the students have so many questions about what it means to be LGBTQ, even if they themselves aren't. And I think just creating comfort in the classroom around like not everyone has the knowledge, right? Like if you're a straight cisgender person in a heterosexual relationship, you probably don't know a ton about what it means to be queer, and that's okay. And I think it's all right to say it's okay to ask questions that may seem silly. It's okay to ask for clarification if you don't understand something, and just start with creating comfort and go from there. That would be my advice.
Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. Byron, I'm going to come to you next. I want you to think about, because it wasn't that long ago that you were in the classroom, right? But now you're a professional. Now you're out here doing this work. And I want to ask you, when you think about the current state of PR and communications, what is missing in the practice regarding the LGBTQIA plus community?
Yeah, thank you, Netra. So I think overall, we are improving in a lot of ways, both in terms of representation and some of our like internal and external practices. However, I think like a lot of my frustrations at times with the industry is that a lot of our internal communications and our external communications like don't always match policy, and or like what types of clients like we choose to work with, and also like what the day-to-day experience looks like for our employees. So I think there's really two buckets I can break this down into. Both from like there's culture and how we're expressing that in and out of the agency life, and then like what policies like we practice both as a firm all together, and like how our different departments intersect. And so I think when we think of like from a culture, culture aspect, it's very similar to what we might do in the classroom. And that's creating like a space like where everyone, regardless of like their identity, their sexuality, their background, feels that they are able to be their whole selves without undue repercussion. And I think a big part of like how we create that kind of space is by being explicit about our agencies and our departments being spaces where people like don't need to like hide like who they are on a daily basis. And I think a lot of this also goes back to us as professionals leading by example. Like being open with as we introduce ourselves like to our colleagues within reason, within our own for our own safety and comfort, like being open to sharing our stories and being open about who we are in the firm. I'm a little biased because the agency that I am currently with, Mixte, we're actually majority LGBT, and like everyone from the top down has been like very intentional and open about creating an inclusive space. However, even with that in mind, I also come from like I've been very fortunate in my career that I've been with agencies and with clients who are very accepting and are very like intentional about LGBTQ representation. But even with that in mind, like I didn't necessarily feel comfortable disclosing that I was trans at first until one of my colleagues shared that they were non-binary identified, and that was kind of for me, like I identify as trans male, and so like day to day, I don't often feel the need to like disclose that I'm like a member of the trans community. But even then, like even with an agency that is very open and LGBT accepting, like it took, I think, having someone who was already open about their identity for me to feel comfortable being open as well.
Thank
so
you.
I think that's a big part. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So Dr. Reynolds, I want to kick this back to you because you shared with us a graphic of something that's an example of queer washing and something that's not necessarily well done. Can you give us any examples of aspects that are well done, that feel authentic and are authentic in the communication?
So full disclosure, I am not a PR scholar, and I don't have any examples at the top of my head that I can think of from the PR field, but I would point everyone to Sex Education on Netflix, which is a streaming series. I'll spell it out in the chat. A streaming series that I think has a very authentic queer storyline integrated into it, and which feels very engaging of both the realities of being LGBTQ and sort of the oppressions that go along with that. Does so from multiple identity standpoints, so not just looking at what it means to be a white queer youth, but what it means to be a brown immigrant, son of immigrants, I should say, living as a gay person in the UK. It is such a great series. If you have not watched it, it is the most authentic representation of, I think, just young people's existence in general that I've seen, but it really integrates well these LGBTQ storylines as primary storylines, not as sidekicks or background to the show itself. So that's my example, not from PR. Maybe Dr. Wrigley can jump in with a good example from the public relations field.
Well, I wish I could. But honestly, I can't call one to mind right now, which is telling in and of itself. You've prompted me to do some digging, though, and I think I will do that as maybe a next project.
Byron, I'm going to bring this back to you. Maybe you are there any that are well done? And I agree with you, Dr. Wrigley. It's telling. And Dr. Reynolds, I did see Sex Education, and I did notice that, and I would agree, audience, we're not getting paid for this, but if you have not seen it on Netflix, definitely see it, because it was definitely, I felt it was definitely inclusive and told a different side of the story that we rarely or never see. So Byron, back to the question, are there any anything that's well done that you think of in the practice?
Well, unfortunately, I can't think of any specific campaigns or like public things that I've seen like companies do. But from like internally, I mean, one thing that I'm very encouraged by are like a number of companies that have normalized practices like sharing pronouns, or updating employee records with like an employee's like. See, and I really hate the term preferred name or chosen name, because, you know, to me, like, your name is whatever you choose to share. But like names that are, but oftentimes, when you're trans or non-binary, like your name isn't always like what's currently on your documents. Because that's updating all that's like a bit of a, that's a process. And so like a lot of companies internally, I'm very happy to see. I'm saying my agency does as well, but like agency if I worked with in the past and other companies I know of have made it easier than ever to like update the like your name and like payroll and like internal and external systems. And then sharing, and then of course like the practice of sharing pronouns, which we can have a deeper discussion on like whether that's like enough, like adequate representation, but like I do find that at least opens up the conversation about like gender identities that are not male or female, and then normalizes, of course, bringing our whole selves in, and however we identify.
Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing, Byron. So Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Wrigley, I want to ask this question when we go back to the classroom. And regardless of what you teach currently, the classroom is really the classroom of life, right? What's missing from curriculum regarding LGBTQIA+? Are there, and again, in the curriculum, what's there? Does it need to Is it just requiring an update? Is it missing big chunks? And then are there any aspects that are well done that we can point to and say, hey, this is a resource, professor, adjunct professor that's teaching and having this experience in the classroom, here's something that you can use right now to help you and help your students?
I'll jump in and first caution that curricula look very different depending on the institution that you work in and what your accreditation requirements are from different PR and journalism boards. So at Cal State Fullerton, where we are accredited by ACE JMC, which is the sort of national accreditation board for journalism and mass comm programs, we have adjusted our curriculum. So very much like this discussion series, we used to have a class that was, I think, called Representations of Ethnicity in Media. And we expanded that curriculum to continue to include, of course, representations of race and ethnicity, but the class is now called Mass Media and Diversity. And that includes discussions of advertising, public relations, journalism, looking at race, gender, sexuality, social class, religion, health status, mental health, socioeconomic status. And I think making it clear to students and to administrators that many people are multiply marginalized in our American society, and that issues of queerness and race and socioeconomic status and religion often are very intertwined. I think that that's a curricular step that we've made recently that's really been beneficial to our students. And that class is so popular. We cannot offer enough sections of it. Students want these elements of diversity covered early in the curriculum, and they want to start talking about how they can integrate race, gender, sexuality, social class into their projects for their capstones. The other thing that we do at Cal State Fullerton is, we have a internship program that often places students, of course, within PR or advertising firms across the Southland. And our queer students have shared with each other resources of internships that tend to work for them. So I think when we have students developing whisper networks, it's important that we start to formalize those things in spreadsheets and PDFs as faculty. So we know, this student will be comfortable working at this agency, or this brand has a good reputation of hiring our students that are queer after they graduate. And as a queer faculty member, I think I know that pretty intuitively, but folks who may not be part of the queer community on faculty may not know that. So I think formalizing queer networks and developing diversity-oriented classes is a good start. Over at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, my colleague Kelsey Whipple has launched a class on, I think it's called Reporting and Communicating About Gender and Sexuality. If you have the opportunity to develop classes like that in your curriculum that are focused specifically on representations of gender and sex, I think that can be meaningful as well, because women also experience a lot of systemic oppression in the media, and to talk about gender issues, not just from a trans or queer perspective, but also look at a feminist perspective, I think is important as well. So those would be my recommendations.
Dr. Wrigley?
Well, Dr. Reynolds pointed out accreditation issues, and those sometimes suppress the desire to offer classes we would like to. And the pressures on smaller liberal arts colleges like the one where I teach, where enrollments are dipping and the number of 18-year-olds in the population is declining. It becomes a more competitive marketplace where career-ready courses take precedence over courses that some consider fluff. We wouldn't, but many people would. The pressure to not include minors or even majors in sex and gender and things like that, to cut the number of faculty and only offer the core courses that make people employable. Now, having said that, at Curry College, we have a general education requirement of 3 courses in global and diversity issues, which I think makes us better and a little bit more distinctive. You know, we have really too few books, case studies, articles that practitioners can draw upon to develop their curriculum. I know, perhaps Dr. Reynolds knows, of no central location that's a repository for resources and information that would be helpful. I think that should be developed. Maybe we should take that on. And I know years ago, in trying to submit research of this type to be published, there were those of us who were just stonewalled, even refused jobs because that was our area of research. I had one university ready to hire me until they found out that this was my research stream and who I was personally, and decided I was not appropriate. That was a long time ago, but it still happens today.
Byron, again, I'm going to ask you to pull on your experience as a graduate. When you were in the classroom, was there anything that you thought to yourself, like, or after the fact, after graduating, I wish not only I had been taught this, but this was something that was a part of the curriculum for my classmates?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I will say that like a lot of my professors, you know, were either members of the LGBT community themselves or were intentional about having that representation in the classroom. Like it wasn't universal. So I think one thing that I really wish we'd had as students, even in the undergrad class, was I think just like more resources on campus and like more classes in general that like really covered like not just the trans experience, but like diverse representation overall. I think like we had one gender communications class at my college, Western University, at least at the time I went. Another representation, depended on the class and the professors' like own additions to the curriculum. Like some of our courses on like social media and public relations, include a couple sections as pertinent on how LGBTQ communities like use social media to like build networks, which I like the term whisper networks because very, very true in my experience, like as far as like finding resources on and off campus. I really think a lot of it's just like, more is the better. Like I would have loved to see, but it's just more dialogue and more opportunities to learn about, how as a future communications professional, like I could be better inclusive of, like in your topic we left out, the experiences of people with disabilities, or like the immigrant experience, and so on and so forth. Like I think just like having more resources in place and having more opportunities to see real case studies in the classroom.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for sharing more case studies in the classroom. Dr. Reynolds, I'm going to come to you, sticking with the classroom theme. 2020, the pandemic, so many things happened and changed not only how we relate to each other on a personal level, not only how we relate to each other at work, but obviously the classroom. We went online. How does communication change in an online learning environment? Are there certain subjects or topics that become easier to teach in an online setting versus an in-person setting?
I think this is such an important question, as all of our universities and colleges grapple with how we will move forward from virtual learning. Will this become a permanent element of our curricula? Is this something that's going to phase out over the coming years? At Cal State Fullerton, where we're a majority commuter campus and many of our students have caretaking duties for children or elders, online education is here to stay. So I think it's just good if we accept that and move forward with that understanding, at least at these big universities. In my experience, I'm still teaching 75% online. In my experience, these discussions around any sort of controversial or taboo topic, including LGBTQIA issues, tend to work better in these virtual formats because students don't feel the social pressure that they might feel in a classroom around things like coming out or disclosing identity, or even asking what peers might consider stupid questions. And there are no stupid questions, of course, but students get anxiety about this. So in my sexual communication class, which is fully online currently, I've noticed that the chat, much like this one, it's constantly blinking, question after question, so much engagement, students sharing personal stories, students dropping links to case studies that they want to analyze. I think personally that classes like diversity and mass communication, sexual communication, or gender and communication, even some of the general education classes that are the baseline for your curricula, large lectures, they can work better in these online formats when controversial topics are part of the curriculum. And for me personally, I have seen better engagement and more curious engagement with questions of LGBTQ communication in those online classes. And I think, again, it's crucial to create a safe space and to let students know that regardless of how they identify, they are welcome in the classroom. And if they do belong to a marginalized community that's the focus of discussion, that they can feel welcome to contribute their opinions and perspectives, but not required to. So personally, that's been my experience. I do think that online learning is the new frontier. And I do think that it serves a lot of these topics courses better in many cases than the large lecture format where someone's asleep in the back of the room and everyone's at risk of getting COVID.
Dr. Wrigley, before I kick this question over to you, I do want to encourage those of you who are here to drop your questions and comments in the chat as well. Dr. Wrigley, in your experience, or what are your thoughts around having classes that are easier in this online setting, in this new frontier, than they are in person?
Well, I would echo what Dr. Reynolds has said about it being a space where things seem to be easier to disclose and share. I think we have to acknowledge too the halo effect of the pandemic and being online. And for my students, it's taken at least a semester or two for their enthusiasm about learning and engagement to come back. The pandemic had a lot of effects on people in many different ways. And at times at the beginning when we were online by needing to be or having to be, things were diminished in terms of engagement and kind of forced. And students weren't used to being online. Now they are, and I think they're more comfortable now. Online is here to stay. There are faculty who still resist online teaching, who don't take the time to be trained in it or understand it. It is different, but it also can be a unique opportunity. And so I think colleges offering faculty training in how to use online most effectively would be very helpful.
Awesome. Byron, I'm going to bring this question to you because, like me, you're working remotely. And, online learning is not restricted to the classroom. There's online working. And then when you're working, you're always learning. We're all students continuously. Are there certain aspects of being a professional in PR and communications that you find are easier in this online setting than they were when you were in person?
Oh, bar none. Well, actually, like before the pandemic, I was actually a hybrid worker. So I was already fairly used to working online, but I think for me, like so many things I could say about like virtual, like working virtually that I am an evangelical for it. Like not only am I, I think, but I think the big thing like that I love and appreciate about it is that as professionals, like working from our own homes, like allows us, the comfort of being able to be more fully ourselves, like whether, and I think I think it's everything from, my colleagues who have children, like being able to be, to not really have to like sharp delineate between like their lives as parents and lives as workers, but really small, silly things like the fact that like once in a while my cat might walk across my screen. And I do find, I think like a lot of your students, Dr. Reynolds and Dr. Wrigley, that there's a lot of topics that I'm much more comfortable talking about in a virtual space than I am in person. Like to be fully honest, like I don't know if I would be quite as comfortable like being a part of this conversation in person and disclosing that like, hey, I'm a member of the trans community, like in a space like where I might be then expected to walk out and have someone physically talk to me about what that means, and that conversation potentially being an uncomfortable one. Versus virtually, like, we engage and then we have a little bit that physical buffer, at least as of right now. And hopefully in like 5-10 years, that'll be a nothing burger. But at least as of right now, I think it does help to, not only be able to like have, many more people included in the conversation that otherwise would physically be able to, but have a buffer between ourselves and our space as a matter of safety. And
thank you for sharing that, Byron. So final thoughts. I want to give each of you about 30 seconds to ponder this question and give us your response. What's the one thing you'd like to see academia, corporate, agency, allies do differently today that would have a positive and immediate impact on bettering the state of communication and public relations regarding the LGBTQIA plus community? Who would like to start?
ooh, I have a long laundry list, but I think like one thing you can do today, right now, if you are, a CEO or you're responsible for like your agency or your corporation's, corporate donations, is stop donating to candidates and organizations that sponsor legislation that bans our right to live as we choose.
Thank you, Byron. Dr. Wrigley, Dr. Reynolds, what's that one thing?
I feel like there are so many things that could be improved. It's hard to choose just one. I think if any of you have seen me speak before, you hear me talking about two things all the time, regardless of the topic of discussion, and they are fair compensation and labor practices and mental health. And I think all companies hiring Gen Zers especially need to realize that they're not drinking the Kool-Aid anymore. They're not going to be there on site 40 hours a week to deal with office drama. So I think giving ample time off PTO And also not requiring doctor's notes for things like mental health days if they come up, because as queer people, we have them, I think, a lot more often than some of our colleagues. Also, having enough time to go to doctors, which are only open weekdays between 9 to 5. A lot of queer folks, of course, may be HIV pause. They may have gender affirming care that they need to receive. They may just need standard STI testing more regularly than your general employee. And those things are possible during the daytime. Folks need to have time off to attend their appointments. We have non-traditional families also. So understanding the responsibilities of childcare in queer families, and that responsibility may look different than in cis families or straight families. And then finally, the compensation element. Queer folks, like other minoritized communities, are underpaid. We're undercompensated compared to our straight male colleagues. And I think every corporation, every academic institution needs to be looking at staff retention and how you can keep your queer folks around, because we demand a sort of different working environment than folks who have bought into sort of the corporate mindset in previous generations. So fair practices in labor and adequate time off. That's my contribution.
Thank you, Dr. Reynolds. Dr. Wrigley, close us out.
Well, these were all great suggestions. I guess mine is a little bit smaller, more localized. And that would be to tell all faculty to step out of their comfort zones, read, be a sponge, talk to your colleagues who are members of our community, ask them questions, invite them to be guest speakers. I'm willing to be a guest speaker anywhere. I have been a lot. I think if we don't encourage each other as teachers to embrace difference and to make it something that students can be really excited about and interested in, if we resist those uncomfortable conversations, we're doing a great disservice to our students. And in the long run, we can't move the needle in the right direction. So don't be afraid to step into this space and ask others to join you.
Awesome. Dr. Wrigley, Byron, Dr. Reynolds, thank you all for being here. Thank our audience. Thank you all for being here. And for those of you who will watch us and join us on the replay, I would like to thank our sponsor, the Moody College of Communication at the University of Texas at Austin, for sponsoring. I would also like to thank the IPR team and PRSA EA for making this possible. We thank you all again for joining us for our first rebranded episode of Race in the PR Classroom, now Diversity in the PR Classroom, where we can have these conversations that are wider, deeper, and hopefully mean more and provide more value to you. We look forward to seeing you next month, and thank you again for being here. Have a great week.